Every year, the fate of over 4 million people in northwest Syria hangs in the balance as the United Nations Security Council decides whether they will receive cross-border aid to survive. But what exactly is cross-border aid, and why is it crucial for millions of Syrians, and what is the role of the UN Security Council? Since the start of the Syrian revolution in March of 2011, the Syrian regime has arbitrarily restricted access to aid in opposition-controlled areas of Syria and used the starvation of civilians as a weapon of war. As a result, in 2014, the UN Security Council established the UN Cross-Border Aid Mechanism, allowing the UN and its partners to provide aid to opposition-held areas in northwest Syria without the authorization of Bashar al-Assad's regime. Cross-border aid refers to the delivery of humanitarian assistance across international borders to reach those in need. In the case of Syria, the Assad regime has always blocked what is known as cross-line aid, which is assistance that moves from regime-held areas of the country into non-regime-held territory. This is why cross-border aid has become a lifeline for millions who live outside of Assad's control.
We heard a few days ago that the humanitarian and medical aid may stop. This is a disaster, in every sense of this word, for us, our families, and kids, especially since all the internally displaced person camps depend totally on the aid. We don't have lands to plant, we don't have any crops or jobs. Our families entirely depend on the medical aid and equipment.
Over 4 million civilians live in opposition-held areas of northwest Syria. Over 90% of the population depends on the UN cross-border aid mechanism for life-saving aid, food, and shelter, especially during Syria's harsh winter. Since the creation of the cross-border aid mechanism in 2014, Russia, which is a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a key ally of the Assad regime, has repeatedly abused its veto power to cut down the mandate's deadline and reduce the number of cross-border aid routes. Over the years, Russia and China vetoed renewal resolutions to reduce the number of border crossings to only one. Today, Bab al-Hawa is the only authorized border crossing for delivery of humanitarian assistance to over 4 million people. And if the UN votes to remove Bab al-Hawa, northwest Syria would have to rely on assistance from the government, which never happens. Last year, Russia reduced the cross-border aid renewal from 12 months to just 6. Short deadlines offer no relief guarantees that aid can continue without interruption. The February 6 earthquakes that killed 8,476 in northwest Syria exposed the failures of the UN cross-border aid mechanism and served as a reminder that the Syrian government is not willing to help civilians in northwest, even during devastating natural disasters. After 7 days, the Syrian regime agreed finally to temporarily open 2 additional border crossings from Turkey to northwest Syria for 3 months. But no aid ever reached northwest from the government in Damascus.
After this horrible thing has happened with the earthquake, it is clear that cross-border aid must be indefinite and open-ended. And the fact is, we can't always just use carrots in order to try to get concessions for 6 to 12 months for 1 or 2 border crossings, because again, that's benefiting the people causing the humanitarian disaster. We should be able to say, look, we are funding the United Nations. We want the United Nations to provide the aid to these people that need it. If the UN does not send this aid, this strictly humanitarian aid across without having to get permissions from Russia and Assad, then we need to find another mechanism to do so. Because if the UN is hindering direct aid, then we need another way around it.
By using short deadline extensions and reducing aid routes, Russia keeps millions of civilians in limbo. Under international humanitarian law, any involved party in a conflict is prohibited unjustifiably rejecting proposals for impartial and humanitarian relief efforts, such as cross-border humanitarian assistance. If Russia continues to abuse its veto power to support Assad, is it possible to deliver aid without UN Security Council approval? International law experts say yes. In 2014, leading international experts confirmed that there was no legal barrier to UN cross-border operations in Syria in the absence of a UN Security Council resolution. There still isn't. Former U.S. Ambassador to War Crimes says, under international law, the provision of strictly humanitarian assistance to persons in another country cannot be regarded as an unlawful intervention and does not require government consent or a UN Security Council resolution. Simply put, there are no legal barriers to cross-border aid operations without the UN Security Council. The fate of millions must not depend on the UN Security Council authorization or Syrian regime approval, especially when international law encourages additional avenues to deliver aid.